continuing with part 2 of Lesson on Writing Powerful and Beautiful Sentences, brought to you by Master Edit. You can check out the link in the description to the right, masteredit.net2.net, or netii. Okay, now rhetorical classification of sentences. So first we have loose sentences. In loose sentences, the main subject and verb are at the beginning, and modifying principal phrases and subordinate clauses follow. And we're going to go through examples of each one of these. The periodic sentence is when the main subject and verb come after the introductory subject clause or participle phrase. And if none of this makes sense, don't worry about it. I'll help it make sense by showing examples and putting it in more simple words. The balanced sentence, sentences which are balanced are characterized by parallel structure. Two or more parts of the sentence have the same form. And then we have parenthetical sentences, which is basically just when a subordinate clause interrupts, it comes in the middle somewhere. So here are some examples. The company will build the bridge because it needs the money. This is an example of a loose sentence. And then example of a periodic sentence. Although Mary tries very hard to be polite to her boss, she has trouble hiding her true feelings. So this is an example where you have a clause that comes first, a subordinate clause, followed by the main clause. This is a complete sentence. This first one is not. You can also start it with just a phrase, so it doesn't have to be a clause. It can just be starting with a phrase. Here's an example of a balanced sentence, in which instead of and uses a semicolon. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Another example of a balanced sentence was what we went up here. This is a balanced sentence. So you have the subordinate, subject subordinate, and then you have a subordinate preposition. Or not preposition, predicate, sorry. Then we have the parenthetical, which is basically interrupting. The writer, casting his eyes upon the ground, handed the passenger a small piece of paper. Another example of this is I put up here. This is actually a good example. Kazariel, alone on the road, barely kept his head from swiveling around to see who was being so addressed. Now, you want to be careful with parentheticals. You don't want to use them very often, and you want your parentheticals to be short. This is a short parenthetical here in gray. And you want the interruption to make sense to what you're saying. Sometimes parentheticals can get out of hand. They can be too long, or they're too out of sync with the sentence, and so they don't make a lot of sense to why it's there in the first place, and it should probably be its own separate sentence. And also, when they're too long, the reader has to keep in mind, the writer did what? He has to keep in mind what the writer is going to be doing, and especially if the subject is long, then he has to keep in mind that whole subject, which is a long subject, has to get through this isn't too long, but has to get through it, let's say it's much longer than this, has to get through a long parenthetical, that is an interruption, before he finally gets to the verb. And so that's when we get to our rules here. Or again, take them as suggestions rather than rules. That's how Joseph Williams talks about it. Make the subject short. The writer, very short subject. You can also make it longer than that, but you don't want it so long, obviously, that it becomes confusing to the reader. Get from the subject to the verb quickly. That is, you don't want a bunch of space between the subject and verb. And that's why parentheticals oftentimes are a bad idea, but sometimes they actually add cool variation and rhythm to your writing. Like I really like this example here. Because even though it interrupts the subject and verb, the subject still gets to the verb quickly. That is, he still barely kept his head. It happens quickly rather than this being a long interruption. So that parenthetical doesn't really break the rule anyway. Get from the subject to the verb quickly. Now this means, sorry, I just read that. Get from the verb to the object quickly. Now this means that you don't want a bunch of words or phrases, or even worse, a clause that comes in between the verb, that is the action that the subject is doing, and what's happening, what that action is doing, or is it happening to something else. So examples of where you might have where you put some sort of phrase or clause between a verb and an object would be a bad idea. So an example of where you might interrupt the verb and its object. So here would be on the road, right? This phrase, and so the road would be the object, mounted would be the verb, and heard would be the verb, and Khosreel would be the subject. So Khosreel heard the mounted horseman, and you can actually put an interrupter here, and this would be an example of there's too much space between the object and the verb. Khosreel heard, and actually the object is mounted horseman, and then it's happening on the road. But you can have the interrupter here, and this would be a bad idea as well. Khosreel heard the mounted horsemen as they sang their jingles about their past and farted and something else on the road. That'd be a bad, you don't want to do something like that. You don't want to have this long interruption. But you also don't want a long interruption between here and here. So Khosreel heard, as they were singing and blah 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 and blah, the mounted horseman on the road. So that would be example. So you don't want to put interrupters between things like that. You want to quickly get from the subject to the verb to the object, and then you can follow it with on the road, and then you can have comma, as they sang the songs of their childhood, and so forth. Okay, so let's get back here to the rules. Don't interrupt the subject and verb relationship, or the verb and object relationship. In other words, put phrases before after a complete sentence. So the example then here, she actually follows this advice. She subject to verb to object all happens quickly, and then she follows it with some phrases. And this actually is part of the sentence on the road before he saw them. So this is when you can put a comma, and if you wanted to, as they sing about their childhood, whatever, that's where you put your other information. Or you can put a phrase in the beginning here. So it's better though to keep your phrases either in the beginning or the end of your sentence. Of course, to follow the first rule, which was to actually, this rule's not here yet, sorry, but make the subject short. Kind of, you can think about it also as get to the subject quickly, and that rule is not there, but I think I have written down somewhere else on this page. Anyway, you don't want to have too much of a leading introductory clause, so you don't want your clause to be so long before you get to the subject, because the reader has to hold too much information in their mind, and it's more difficult or unpleasant. Okay, now the important part of these rules, and the reason why I have these listed next to these rules is because they kind of go together. Match characters to subjects. Match actions to verbs. Term nominalization to verbs. We'll go through examples of each one of these. So match characters to subjects means that you don't just want to have the subject, you don't just want to have something as a subject. Obviously a complete sentence will have a subject. But you want a character as a subject. That is, you want a doer. The person that is your subject, there we go. The thing that is your subject, you want it to be a doer, something that is making action, that's actually doing something. In the one case I gave here, interesting enough, these things are doing something. They're making a noise. So even though they're not persons, the subjects of this sentence are doers. They're doing something. That is, they're making noise. Okay, so that just about wraps up this video, and we're really going to start getting into examples now, and how to rearrange sentences, how to write, using these rules, how to remove ands, how to avoid things, and so forth. So the series is just getting started, but we had to go through some of this beginning stuff first. All right, so check out the Master Edit link there on the right. Really awesome software. I recommend it to everyone. It's like having your own editor, but even better because it catches mistakes editors don't catch. So anyway, it has some free examples and stuff and what it does, so check it out.